Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 15, and you can follow along in your bulletins. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to be good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away.
So this passage, is probably, I don't know, maybe we're talking that top 10 most famous of all passages in the Bible. I think if you've gone to many funerals at all, you have heard the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you were from the 60s, or maybe in earlier, you've heard the Birds, and they basically directly quoted this passage, and so it's a familiar one, and it's not familiar just because it's beautiful, and it is. It's like the poetry of it just flows really well. It's a beautiful passage, but it's not just there because it's beautiful. It's because it's meaningful. It communicates something that we know about this life. That for everything there is a season. And for every time, for everything, every matter under heaven, there is a time. There is a time to be born. There is a time to die. There's a time to plant, and there is a time to pluck up what's been planted. There's a time to kill, unfortunately, not murder. There's a time to kill. There's a time to heal. And I wish we would do that a lot more. There's a time to break things down, and there is a time to build things up. There's a time to just bawl your eyes out, cry, and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn, to go to the funeral, to bawl your eyes out again, and to go into deep sadness, to just sit there and cry, to mourn what's lost, and there's also a time to dance for what you have and what God has done to give you all this life that is so good. There's a time to cast away stones. There's a time to gather them back together. There is a time to seek that which is lost, and there's a time to just let it be lost. Let it go. There's a time for us to hold on to things, to keep watch over what God has entrusted to us. But there's also this time to cast away, to let that person or that thing go off into the world and do its thing, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. There's a time for us to tear things apart. There's a time for us to sew things back together. There's a time for us to keep our mouths shut, just let the silence be. And there's a time for us to speak up and make some problems. There's a time for us to love, and there is a time for us to hate even. Maybe not another person, but definitely to hate that which is evil in this world. There's a time for war, and it's today. There is a time for war, unfortunately, at times. But man, is there a time for peace. As the bird said, oh, if we would give it a try. What Solomon is getting at here is that there is a time for all of these emotions, these activities, these matters under the sun. And so often we ignore what God has placed in our lap. And Solomon is saying, hey, I want you to recognize what God has given to you, these times that you're living in. I think none of us want to live in historic times. We might be living in some of those right now with things that are going on in this country and around the world and with AI. No one wants to live in historic times, but doggone it, it seems like God has placed us here. And what Solomon is telling us today is that it's God's hand that has brought us to this time. As we keep going, in this passage, Solomon, he's listed out a lot of these different times, but there are some times that he did not list here. This is an incomplete list, and I have some of them for you, okay? So something that came to mind as I was looking at this passage is that there is a time to recognize the season that you're in and to live according to it, to recognize what God has given to you. I grew up with a father who really emphasized a strong work ethic, and one of the things that he taught me was to hurry as often as you can. If you're going to do something, how about you do it faster because you'll be able to watch more golf. And I was like, I don't want to watch golf, but you'll be able to do something that you actually want to do. And so you hurry, you get it done. But one of the things I also started to find out, and those of you in construction, you probably know this saying. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. So you got to kind of know when to go fast, when to go slow, when you can take a chance, when you got to kind of play it a little safe. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, right? That is a thing that a wise person has in themselves, is they're able to recognize when we got to take the risk, when we got to speak up, when we got to shut up. When we got to take a chance and form a new country, the American Revolution, right? And when we got to play it safe and keep things the way that they are. That's what wisdom is. It's not so much knowing what to do. It's often knowledge. It's knowing how to do it. It's when to do it. Who should do it. That's often where wisdom is. And Solomon is leading us down this direction for us to consider. What season is it that God has put us in this moment? The wise person recognizes it, and they act accordingly. Some people they go down the path of saying, it's like, well, I'm kind of like the baseball player who just breaks up into the major leagues. They often have the tendency to swing at every pitch that they see. But a wise baseball player knows you don't swing at every pitch. You wait for the pitch that you can do damage on, and that's the one you swing at. But there's also the other side of it. I think it was Wayne Gretzky. He said, "You miss 100% of the shots you never take." That's something. That's wisdom, right? It's recognizing when to not swing and when to swing. And in our relationships, this is often where we go wrong. We think, "Oh man, if I just roll over and I never speak up, I never, try to make a change in this relationship, it'll just get better." Or some people, they say, "Oh, I just need to really, every time I see an issue in my spouse or in my child, I need to correct them. I need to really, really get after them." A parent, a spouse, a wise one at least, they know when to be quiet, when to put up a boundary, when to take charge, when to let things lie. That's what wisdom is, okay? And in a surface reading of this passage, you're probably going to hear this and think, yeah, that's what Solomon's really after. He's trying to get us to consider when we should take action, when we should do things. That's not really what this passage is about. It's here, like there's wisdom here. And I think as we live in these times, I am reminded of a couple pastors during World War II. I've been thinking about World War II a lot lately. And one guy, his name is Martin Niemöller. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was a German pastor. He was high up in the German church. He actually met with Hitler a couple times, which I don't know if that's a thing that you really want on your job resume. So it's like, yeah, I got to meet Hitler. I don't think that's really there, but he did. He got to talk with Hitler. And he was actually an anti-Semite. He really kind of bought into a lot of the narrative of the day that the Nazis were propagating, but it was present all over in Europe, that the big problem was the immigrants, it was the Jews, it was the poor people, it was the gays, and it was a lot of the same. You start to hear a lot of the same things today. And that if we were going to take back our country and make it into its glory days as the German nation, we need to get rid of these problem people, get them out of our country any way that we can. And then if we do that, then the working people are going to be safe and secure, and they're going to have a prosperity. And the German church, like so many pastors, and Martin was one of these guys, they talked about Hitler as this flawed individual who had an ego, who had an arrogance and a pride that was just uncontrollable, but he was a vessel, an imperfect vessel that God could use to build up his church and to his country. Sounds familiar to arguments that we've heard many times in our country. He's like David. That's how Martin Niemöller talked about Hitler. But then Hitler started taking actions that were very uncomfortable for Martin and people, but he did not speak up the way that he ought to have. And eventually, Martin, when Hitler tried to take over the church, Martin stood up, and he was like, no, you can't do that. And Hitler threw him in jail, in a concentration camp, and Martin stayed the rest of the war in jail. Eventually, he gets out, though, and he writes a poem that I am sure 90% of you have heard before. When he is regretting not recognizing the season that he was in, he says, "First they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I said nothing. Then they came for the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't say anything. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I'm not a trade unionist, so I said nothing. And then they came for the Jews, and I said nothing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me." There's a time to shoot your shot. And it's often cowardice that leads us to not speak up when we should. And on the other hand of it, I think of a pastor named Reinhold Niebuhr, also in World War II time. He was in Detroit, and coming out of World War I was his major spiritual formation time, and he became, like most people at that time, a pacifist. Because World War I was awful. The brutality of it is just, so incredibly awful. So many people became pacifists because they said, we can never go down this path again. But then the Nazis started coming to power, and Reinhold realized, this is not right. I cannot let tyranny like this go on. And so he really pushed America to join the war effort to stop the Nazis, not because he was worried about America's prosperity, but because he was worried about the prosperity of people who could not defend themselves. And we may not have actually got into the war if it wasn't for Pearl Harbor, but he was a massive mover to help the population say, there's a time where we even have to do something as awful as war to do something good. And he is best known, actually, for authoring something that's called the Serenity Prayer. If you've had any involvement with someone who's in AA, they have heard this prayer, and it's popular elsewhere. And it basically goes like this. And it's a prayer that, as I read this passage, I want to take on for myself. It goes something like this. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change what can be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wise person recognizes the season that God has placed them in, the time that they have available to them, and they act accordingly. But again, this passage is not a how-to, just how to live a wise life. Read it in context. In our Rock Roundup, I said, make sure you read this in context, because you read the rest of the verses before it and afterwards, and you see this isn't just about how to live a good life. What it's actually about is that God is the one who is orchestrating all of these things in this life. God is the one who has done all of these things and has made everything beautiful or fitting in its own time. Solomon says in verse 14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people might fear before him, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But the point that Solomon is getting at, the other time that comes to mind as I read this, is that there is a time to accept God's purposes and times in this life. Instead of going off and forming our own life ourselves, Solomon is reminding us, God puts you in the family that he puts you in. God puts you in the country that he puts you in. God gave you the abilities that he gave you. God puts you in all of these situations and times for his purposes, not yours. God has a plan. You don't. That's what he is getting at here. But as I consider this, I'm thinking of my own life. And maybe you read this passage and you think of something in your life. Is there a time that you saw death as something beautiful? Is there a time when you have looked at mourning and weeping as just the only good thing that can possibly happen in that moment? It's a fitting thing. When I look at these things and I hear them, I would never think of, oh man, I need to, you know what I need more of in my life? Weeping. I need a relationship to end. I need this bad thing to happen. Like, I don't think of that. But I go back and I'm remembering my grandmother. My grandmother, she smoked a lot of tobacco in her life. She had breast cancer, overcame that, and then she got lung cancer and COPD. And towards the end of her life, it was a really bad thing. But throughout her life, she was not walking with the Lord. She didn't know him. And it was as she got cancer, as she got this disease, that she started rethinking her life. And in interacting with my mother, my grandma eventually came to faith in Jesus, a real faith. She grew up kind of like she was bad Catholic, right? But then she actually grew to develop a real faith, and it was the cancer, this awful, awful thing that led her to faith. But then as she is getting to the very end of her life, this life was not good. I've never actually smoked anything in my life. That's something that I just have never done it. And it's not really because of a moral reason. I don't think it's a great thing for you. If a Christian smokes, whatever, I don't care. But for me, I've never done it because I saw my grandmother suffer so bad from it. And I knew I didn't want to suffer in that way. I knew there's a lot of suffering in this life that I could avoid, and some that I can't, and that is one I want to avoid if at all possible. Because as she was dying, we were praying for death. Death was a beautiful thing as she was suffering. And when she did die, there was a sigh. And as I go back and I read this passage, God has made all things beautiful in their own time. Even something as awful as death in that moment was part of God's plan to bring peace. And that's really what Solomon is getting at here. There is a time and a place for all of these things in this fallen world. There is so much trouble in this world that sometimes even death is a good thing. Sometimes a life being plucked up is a good thing. Sometimes a relationship needs to end in order for something new to grow. And I think if I can just pick on Paul for a moment here, with Paul leaving, one of the things that's like hard for me with it is there's like an end of relationship in that way, and there's what has been in this church that's been really good is going to be no more, and that hurts. It's the patterns that Paul has enjoyed all of these years is just going to stop. Him serving you as a pastor and caring for you, that's going to stop. There's a death there, and it hurts. But in order for something new to take place, this painful thing has to happen. In order for a church to get planted or for him to grow in his abilities in other settings where there's more opportunity, this has to happen. And there's a sadness that is just unavoidable with Paul leaving and with any job change. But there's something beautiful in it because of what it's bringing about. But there's a time for us to mourn. There's a time for us to cry over this. There's a time for us to mourn over all these things in our life, to cry over all these things in our life. But there's also a time for us to celebrate and to dream of what is to come. And that's the third time that I see come in this passage, is that there is a time for us to dream for something more, for something new, for something that God has in store. This passage, again, it's definitely not just a how-to on how to live your life in a wise way, nor is it just God is in control and so just deal with it and trust that God has a good plan, just deal with it. It's also reminding us of what God wants us to do in this life. Solomon says, again, in verse 10 and 11, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart. And yet, man can't figure out what God has done from beginning to end. He's dreaming about what eternity might be like, what the eternal God is and what he is doing, what he's up to in this world, and yet they can't figure it out. And I perceived, going down to verse 14, that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. And God has done this so that people fear before him, that they might consider their life in light of eternity. You know, the thing with this life, as we experience it, none of us wants there to be a time to kill. None of us wants there to be a time to die. Like if we're constructing the human experience, we don't write in, okay, after 60 years I die, after 80 years I die. If I eat ice cream, I get heart disease. None of us writes the human story that way, and yet God has written it in this way. And part of it is so that we would dream of a future with him where there is not those painful experiences. I'm sure you have been wondering where things are going in this world with AI and the technological progress. I mean, things just seem to be progressing faster and faster and faster, and it just seems just kind of like an overload of new technologies and having to unlearn things and relearn new things, and it's just a lot. And underneath all of that is a drive to make things better, to dream of a better world, a utopia. And yet, if we look at the progress that we might eventually get to, if even like the most golden of realities comes to be, it's not going to deal with the deep longings that we have in our hearts. I mean, all of us long to be loved unconditionally. We long to be known exactly as we really are. We don't have to fake who we are. We long for significance. We long for meaning beyond ourselves. And none of those things are going to really actually be fixed with a new technology or the human species progressing. If we just look at our life's path and everything goes according to plan, at the end of our lives, we still have the issue that Solomon is talking about here. We still have eternity set in our hearts with nothing on this earth to satisfy it. Nothing on this earth answering the deep longings that we have. Augustine, this guy who existed a few years before the internet, it's like 1,500 years ago, guys. It's a long time ago. He said it best. No one has said it better than him. And he says it as a prayer to God. Oh God, you have made our hearts. You have made us for our. Sorry, he said it really good, and I can't repeat him. Oh God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. That's what's in our hearts. C.S. Lewis, he said it in a few more words in Mere Christianity. He said, the Christian says this: creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, and, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation for that is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. And if that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. Friends, you were made for more than what this life can offer you. These times and these seasons that God has placed you in, they are good. But man, don't they leave you wanting more? More than what this life can offer you? Don't they leave you longing for your human story to be fulfilled? It does for me. When I look at the suffering in this world, I can see that there is nothing that this world is going to be able to do to resolve the pain in my heart as I look at it. And that's also what Solomon is getting at here. God has so constructed this world that as we live in it, we would long for something that is not of this world. We would long for the Creator who created all things to redeem this fallen world. And that's the fourth time that comes to mind as I read this passage. That there is a time as fitting to God, as good to God, for him to fulfill all things. And while Solomon does not give us Jesus Christ's name, I feel like he is writing a blank here and waiting for us to fill it in. Because the reason why God made this world the way it is now under the fallenness of sin is so that we would long for him, so that we would not grow content with this life, but that we would recognize there is something wrong inside us and that we would need to turn to him. He created it so that we would look up. And eventually, God decided to come down. It was fitting, it was good for God the Son to come to earth, to be born, and for him to die. It was fitting and good for God to come here and to plant his word in our hearts, and for him to pluck up all this evil that God has seen us suffering under ever since our fall into sin. It was good and it was fitting for God to come and to destroy the work of Satan on the cross and for him to heal those that sin has oppressed. There was a time for God to come and to show his extreme love for us on the cross, to gather people to himself, to do all this work that this, if you can have some liberty with this passage, to do all this work of his life so that he might redeem us, so that he might heal us, so that he might remove all sin from us and all judgment and give us his perfect righteousness. There was a time for Jesus to hate the sin that was destroying us, and to hate it so much that he would go to the cross and face the wrath of God himself over it. There was a time for him to wage war on sin and death so that we might receive peace with God. There's a time for everything under the sun. And Jesus showed us that in his life. This story of God's salvation for us, it's not just a story about how to live a better life, how to be wise. It's not just this kind of fatalistic story that says, well, God's in control, and I guess I just got to learn to accept it. It's a story of God putting us in this earth that's going to make us long for him, and him actually coming to be with us. Not just giving us a longing, but giving us the fulfillment. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this passage and the work that it's doing in my heart, the work that it's doing in all of our hearts. Lord, I thank you that you have created us for yourself and that we do not grow content for long with anything but you. Lord, I thank you for sending Jesus Christ to be the fulfillment of all of our longings. In your name we pray.